This is Eddie Hyatt. This is the Awakening Podcast. So glad you've joined me. We're starting a new series this week that we're calling The Truth About Paul and Women. The Truth About Paul and Women. There are two statements of Paul that have been so distorted and misused and abused and used to marginalize women and keep them out of roles and ministries of leadership in the church. And we're going to show you today how and why Paul has been distorted. Such an important series. And I hope you will be sharing this with your friends. You know, those two passages that have been misused by Paul, there's only two. 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35, 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 12. And we will get to those passages in this series and explain those passages in their historical context and in the original language, which sheds incredible light on them. But in the meantime, Paul had so many positive things to say about women and even recognized women in leadership, even recognized one woman as an apostle and recognized women as functioning in all different kinds of roles of leadership. And today we're going to talk about the women of Philippi whom Paul said labored with me in the gospel. The women of Philippi whom Paul said labored with me in the gospel. And we're going to show today that word labor includes the ideas of preaching, teaching, and pastoring. So let's get started. Now there are three points that I want to make today about Paul's ministry in Philippi. Because remember, this is our theme today, the women of Philippi whom Paul said labored with me in the gospel. Three points I want to make, and we're going to elaborate on. Number one, Paul began the church in Philippi, which was the first church in Europe, with a group of praying women. No men involved. He began the first church in Europe, which was in the city of Philippi, with a group of praying women. Secondly, a woman's home became the meeting place for the first church in Europe, which was in Philippi. And Paul later, in his letter to the Philippians, he referred to these women as having labored with me. And as I said, the word labor carries the sense and the connotations of the work that is exerted in preaching, teaching, and pastoring. And so let's go now to Acts chapter 16, which gives us the story of the founding of the first church in Europe, which began with a group of praying women. Now, Acts chapter 16, beginning at verse 13. They have come to this city as a result of a supernatural vision that Paul had. Before this, they were kind of struggling to try to find where to go. And every time they would start in a direction, they would sense the Holy Spirit saying, no, don't go there. And so finally, Paul has a vision, and a man, Luke says, a man of Macedonia. Luke is the author of Acts. A man of Macedonia stood saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. So immediately they assumed that God had called them to Macedonia. And Philippi was the first major city that they came to in Macedonia. And Luke says in verse 13, and there are four at this time in Paul's team. There is Paul, there's Timothy, there is Silas, and there is Luke. And Luke is writing the narrative, and he says in Acts 16:13, and on the Sabbath day we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. And so there are several points we want to make here about this, but first let me say this. Paul has been called a misogynist and a woman hater because of these two passages that have been taken out of context and misread and abused. But here we see how Paul has such a personal and a comforting and accepting relationship with women. He's comfortable with women. He didn't preach them a sermon. He didn't stand up and preach them a sermon. He didn't invite them to a meeting. Luke says we sat down, got on the same level with them, and had a personal conversation with these women. I'm going to read that again. And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke. Paul sat down, and those three with him, they sat down and had an easy, comfortable, face-to-face conversation with these women. At this point, I want to read a quote by a famous British scholar, F.F. Bruce. He said, Paul delighted in the company of his fellows, both men and women. The most incredible feature in the Paul of popular mythology is his alleged misogyny. Misogyny is a word that means to hate women. He says the most incredible feature in the Paul of popular mythology is his alleged misogyny. He treated women as persons. Wow. And that's what we see here. He's treating women as equal human beings. He sits down with them and talks face to face with them. Now, a couple of points we need to make here. Paul normally went into a synagogue in the cities of the Roman Empire because he, as a Pharisee, as a Jew, a teacher of Judaism, having been trained by one of the most famous teachers and rabbis in first century Judaism, trained by Gamaliel in Jerusalem, he would have an opening. They would be excited to have him in the synagogues of the diaspora throughout the Roman Empire. And so he went where he had an open door, and that's a good lesson for you. Go where you have an open door. You feel God's called you? Don't beat on doors that are resistant. Go where there is an opening. If it's out on the street, if it's in a coffee shop, if it's one-on-one with someone, go where you have an open door. And so Paul would go to the synagogues. He would start there. Now, he would usually get kicked out, and he'd have to take the ones who accepted his message and go and start meeting someplace else. But he always started in the synagogues. Now, apparently there was no synagogue in Philippi, which means there was a very small Jewish community. Because according to Jewish law at that time, for a synagogue to be established in a city, there had to be a quorum of 10 Jewish men who were heads of households. And only then could a synagogue be established. And so since there was no such quorum of 10 Jewish men, in fact, there were only a group of women who met down by the riverside to pray, and it was probably made up of both Jewish and Gentile women, because there were three kinds of people that met in the synagogues of the diaspora of the Gentile cities throughout the Roman Empire. Three kinds of people. There were the Jews who were born Jewish. There were the proselytes, the Gentiles who had converted to Judaism and had taken on the obligation of all the Jewish laws and customs. And then there was what was called the God-fearers. And these were Gentiles who were attracted to the God of Judaism. They were attracted to the monotheism, the worship of one God, because the Roman Empire was absolutely pagan and polytheistic. They worshiped a multitude of gods. And so the God-fearers would come and attend the synagogues and listen to the reading of the Scriptures and to the explanations of the Scriptures, but they weren't quite ready. They weren't comfortable with committing themselves to keep all of the Jewish laws and customs and festivals and so on. So they were called God-fearers. Probably these women who met down by the riverside were made up of both Jewish women and God-fearers. And the Bible says that the Lord opened up their hearts. So Judaism may require 10 males to start a synagogue. Listen to this. Paul had no problem starting a Christian congregation with a group of praying women. Wow. I'll say that again. Judaism may have required 10 Jewish males for the beginning of a synagogue, but Paul had no problem beginning a church with a group of praying women. And so he begins the church in Philippi with this group of praying women. One of these women's name is Lydia, who is a successful businesswoman, and she invites Paul and his 3 team members, Luke, Timothy, and Silas, to come to her house, to her estate, and to stay there and live there and make that the base of their operations. And she is baptized, Luke says, and her entire household with her. Now, this woman was the head of a household. Listen to this. Now, we don't know how she became the head of the household. Luke doesn't tell us. We don't know if she is a widow, we don't know if she is just a single woman who has become a successful businesswoman, because a household did not only consist of a nuclear family of children, but would consist also of servants, of slaves, of distant relatives, aunts and uncles. The more successful a person became, then the more of their relatives they would be willing to take in and to care for and become a part of their household. Successful households could consist of hundreds of people. Now, this woman obviously had a large estate. She had no problem accommodating 4 more adult men. And when she decided to be baptized, Luke says her entire household followed her in baptism. So obviously this woman is a leader. She is a successful woman in the business world and in the city of Philippi. And her house becomes Paul's base of operations, and it also becomes the meeting place for the church in Philippi. For later, when Paul and Silas, and we don't have time to go into this story, but you know the story, how they were arrested and they were beaten and put in jail. But as they prayed and praised God at midnight, God sent an earthquake and released them, and the jailer and his household come to Christ. And then, but before they leave Philippi, they go to the house of Lydia and they meet with the brothers and sisters, where they encourage them, and then they go on their way, and they leave behind the first church in Europe that is hosted by a woman in her home. I think it would be incredulous to think that Lydia sat over in the corner and never opened her mouth. No, absolutely not. Now, I want to close with this. Paul wrote a letter to this same congregation years later. And he wrote it from prison in Rome, under a house arrest in Rome. And in this letter, he acknowledged the women who labored with him. In Philippians 4:3, he said, I urge you also, true companion, or the literal word, it means yoke fellow. And some think he may be talking to the entire Philippian congregation, which he considers and he views as his partners and those who are yoked up with him in the ministry of the gospel, because they continued to financially support Paul in his missionary journeys after he left there. And he says, so in chapter 4, verse 3, I urge you also, true yoke fellow or true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel. And the word labor carries connotations of the energy that is exerted in teaching, preaching, and pastoring. For Jesus said, there's a passage in Matthew, and I believe I have it right here. Matthew 9:3-8 tells about Jesus when he went out and he saw a great multitude, and they seemed to him as like sheep without a shepherd. The word shepherd and the word pastor are the very same Greek word. They're both translated from the same Greek word, poimen. Always remember that. When you see shepherd, you see pastor. They come from the very same Greek word. And Jesus saw them that they were like sheep without a shepherd, without a pastor. And he said to his disciples, pray the Lord of the harvest that he will send laborers into his harvest. And so we see from the words of Jesus that laborers would meet the needs for shepherds or pastors, thus showing that labor in the gospel included what we today call pastoring. Help those women, Paul said, who labored with me in the gospel there, in establishing that church, who labored with me in preaching, teaching, and pastoring. Help those women. May congregations today, may the church rise up today, may Christian leaders be enlightened today to help those women who have been called and commissioned to labor in the gospel. God bless you. I'm Eddie Hyatt. Check out my website, eddieHyatt.com. Check out my blog and follow me on Facebook. And I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we are going to continue this series on the truth about Paul and women. God bless you.